This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about the most socially uncomfortable execution conversation this channel has ever had. Not uncomfortable because the psychology is complicated, not uncomfortable because the research is ambiguous or the practical application is unclear. Uncomfortable because the truth it points to requires something that no productivity framework, no habit system, and no morning routine will ever ask of you. Because asking it costs the author readers and the coach clients and the influencer followers. It requires you to look honestly at the people in your life, the ones who are present daily, the ones who occupy your time, your energy, your attention, and your emotional bandwidth with the kind of consistent, structural regularity that makes them not just relationships, but environmental conditions. And to ask, with the kind of honesty that most of us will do almost anything to avoid, whether the people you are surrounded by are a headwind or a tailwind to the most important execution of your life. Not whether they are good people, not whether you love them or owe them loyalty or have history with them that makes the question feel almost disloyal to ask. Whether the social environment they collectively create is one in which your best execution is possible, or one in which it is quietly, continuously, structurally suppressed. I know how that sounds. I want to stay with it anyway, because the research is unambiguous. And the cost of not having this conversation, the execution cost, the output cost, the life cost, is one I watched myself pay for years before I was willing to look at it directly. I want to tell you about a period in my life that I have circled around in previous conversations on this channel without ever landing on its most honest explanation. In the years before the business collapse, the years when I could feel the execution eroding without being able to identify the cause, I had a social environment that I had never once examined as a variable in my professional performance. I had people around me who were comfortable, not malicious, not deliberately undermining, comfortable. People whose relationship with ambition, risk, and the kind of sustained, difficult execution that building something real requires was fundamentally different from the relationship I was trying to build with those things. There was a group of men I spent significant time with, people I had known for years, people I genuinely liked, whose response to any serious conversation about what I was building was a particular kind of deflating humor. Not cruel, just the reflexive leveling that happens in groups where one person's visible ambition creates social discomfort in people who have made peace with their own smaller version of what is possible. Every time I left those social environments, I felt slightly less certain about what I was trying to build. Not because of anything specific that was said. Because of the cumulative atmospheric effect of spending time in a social field where the version of me I was trying to become was subtly, consistently, gently discouraged. There was also a person closer to home, someone I cared about deeply, whose own unexamined anxiety about change and risk produced a constant low-level friction around every significant execution attempt I made. Again, not deliberately, not maliciously, just the natural human tendency to keep the people we love inside the radius of what feels safe to us. I told myself for years that the problem was my habits, my systems, my discipline, my mindset. I rebuilt all of those things multiple times with genuine effort and genuine temporary success. And then I would return to the same social environment, and the same erosion would begin again. It was not until I understood the research on social influence and behavioral contagion that I finally had an honest account of what had been happening. And what it pointed to was not a habit problem, it was a people problem. The research on the relationship between social environment and individual execution is some of the most robust and most consistently ignored science in all of behavioral psychology. Ignored not because it is obscure, it has been replicated across dozens of independent studies, but because its implications are socially and emotionally costly in a way that makes most people instinctively resist engaging with it honestly. The foundational work here comes from Dr. Nicholas Christakis and Dr. James Fowler at Harvard University and UC San Diego, respectively, whose landmark research on social networks and behavioral contagion produced findings that permanently changed the scientific understanding of how human behavior spreads through social connection. Christakis and Fowler analyzed data from thousands of individuals across decades and found that behaviors, emotional states, and even life outcomes spread through social networks with the same structural regularity as infectious disease, not through conscious influence or deliberate persuasion, through the subtle, continuous, largely unconscious process of behavioral and emotional attunement that happens when humans spend significant time in proximity to each other. Their most cited finding, which has been replicated across multiple independent studies, is that obesity, smoking, happiness, loneliness, and numerous other behavioral and emotional states cluster in social networks not randomly but along the lines of social connection. and that the influence extends not just to your direct social contacts, but to their contacts and their contacts' contacts. 3 degrees of separation. What this means for your execution environment is precise and significant. The behavioral norms, the emotional states, the relationship with effort and ambition and risk that characterize the people you spend the most time with are not merely their attributes. They are atmospheric conditions that your own behavior, emotional state, and execution capacity are continuously being shaped by, whether you are aware of the shaping or not. You are not executing in a social vacuum. You are executing inside a social field, and that field either supports the execution or suppresses it. The second body of research comes from Dr. Sonia Lubomirsky at the University of California, Riverside, whose work on the determinants of happiness and well-being produced a finding that extends directly to the execution domain. Lubomirsky found in her research that approximately 40% of individual well-being and behavioral functioning is accounted for by what she calls intentional activity, the deliberate choices a person makes about how to spend their time and attention. But she also found something that receives far less attention in popular discussions of her work: the single most powerful predictor of sustained positive functioning, more powerful than individual habit, more powerful than mindset, more powerful than any internal psychological variable she studied, was the quality and nature of the person's closest social relationships. Not the number of relationships, not the warmth of them in a general sense, the specific degree to which the people closest to the person supported, challenged, and elevated their functioning, rather than accommodating, enabling, or subtly discouraging it. The research is explicit. Your closest social relationships are not separate from your execution capacity. They are one of its primary determinants. And optimizing your habits while leaving your social environment unexamined is like tuning the engine of a car while leaving the handbrake engaged. The third explanation draws from the work of Dr. David McClelland at Harvard University. The motivational psychologist whose decades of research on achievement motivation produced a finding that has been quoted so frequently it has lost some of its original force. McClelland found that the most reliable predictor of a person's income, achievement level, and professional output over time was not their intelligence, their education, or their individual work habits. It was the average of the 5 people they spent the most time with. This finding has been repeated so often in motivational content that it has started to feel like a cliché. But I want to restore its research meaning, because what McClelland was documenting was not a vague observation about ambient influence. He was documenting the precise mechanism by which social norms and behavioral standards are transmitted, internalized, and reproduced through close social contact. The people you spend the most time with set the behavioral reference point for what is normal. What level of effort is standard? What level of ambition is reasonable? What degree of risk is acceptable? What quality of output is considered sufficient? And the human brain, whose social calibration system is among its most ancient and most powerful features, continuously adjusts individual behavior toward the group norm. If the group norm is comfort, the execution will trend toward comfort. If the group norm is ambitious, disciplined, high-standard output, the execution will trend upward toward that standard. Not through conscious imitation, through the deep, automatic, biological process of social attunement that Christakis and Fowler's research documented so precisely. The fourth mechanism is what Dr. Henry Cloud, the clinical psychologist and author whose work on boundaries and relationships draws from decades of clinical research, identified as the specific cost of what he calls necessary endings. Cloud found in his clinical research that one of the most consistently avoided and most consequential decisions available to a person seeking to change their life trajectory is the decision to end, limit, or restructure the relationships that have become structural obstacles to growth. Not toxic relationships in the dramatic sense, relationships that are simply misaligned with the direction of growth, relationships built on an earlier version of the person that the current direction of development is leaving behind. Cloud's research showed that the inability to make necessary endings, driven by loyalty, guilt, conflict avoidance, and the genuine love that often exists alongside the misalignment, is one of the most common and most significant execution suppressors in adult professional life. And he found something that is simultaneously comforting and clarifying. The necessary ending is not always a termination. Frequently, it is a restructuring, a deliberate reduction in the time, energy, and emotional bandwidth allocated to a specific relationship. Not because the relationship has no value, but because the current allocation is consuming resources that the most important execution requires. Here is the practical framework. 3 interventions, each one actionable, each one grounded in the research rather than in vague advice about surrounding yourself with better people. The first intervention is what I call a social field audit. Drawing directly from Christakis and Fowler's behavioral contagion research, the goal is to make the invisible social influence in your life visible enough to be examined honestly. Write down the 5 people you spend the most significant time with, not the people you like most or the people who matter most emotionally. The people who occupy the most hours of your social attention each week. For each person, write honest answers to 3 questions. After spending time with this person, do I feel more or less capable of the execution I am trying to sustain? Not more or less happy, more or less capable. Does this person's relationship with effort, ambition, and risk pull my own standards upward or accommodate them downward? Is the version of me that shows up in this relationship closer to the person I'm trying to become or closer to the person I'm trying to move away from? You are not looking for reasons to exit relationships. You are looking for an honest map of the social field you are executing inside. Because you cannot design an environment that supports your best execution while remaining unconscious of the social forces that field contains. The second intervention addresses McClelland's reference point finding, and it requires a deliberate, structural decision about where you will source your new behavioral reference points, since simply removing misaligned social influence without replacing the reference point leaves a vacuum that the old norms will quickly refill. Identify one social context, one community, one professional group, one recurring gathering of any kind, in which the behavioral norm is the level of execution you are trying to reach. Not a context where you will be the most accomplished person in the room, a context where your current execution level is unremarkable, where the people around you are operating at or above the standard you are trying to internalize. Christakis and Fowler's research shows that behavioral contagion operates in both directions. The same mechanism that pulls execution downward toward a lower group norm will pull it upward toward a higher one. You do not need to be consciously inspired by the people around you. You need to be socially calibrated by them, and that calibration happens automatically, biologically, given sufficient exposure. New social context. Entered deliberately, attended consistently. That is the intervention, not inspiration, calibration. The third intervention addresses Cloud's necessary endings research and provides the most practically difficult but most structurally important action available for the chronic execution suppressor whose social environment is the primary obstacle. For each relationship identified in the social field audit as a consistent execution suppressor, make one specific, bounded, non-dramatic restructuring decision, not a dramatic exit. A deliberate reallocation. Reduce the weekly time allocation to that relationship by one specific meeting, conversation, or social occasion. Redirect that time, explicitly, in your calendar, with the same commitment you would give a professional obligation, to the elevated social context identified in the second intervention. You are not abandoning relationships. You are reallocating social bandwidth in the same way you would reallocate any finite resource, away from the uses that produce the lowest return and toward the uses that produce the highest. Cloud's research is explicit that this reallocation, done without drama, without announcement, and without the kind of explicit conversation that turns a personal decision into a social conflict, is both ethically sound and practically effective. The relationship is not ended. Its claim on your most finite execution resource is reduced to a level the relationship's actual contribution justifies. I want to close with something I resisted understanding for longer than I should have. The people I loved most in the years before the collapse were not the problem. The problem was the social field we had collectively constructed, a field in which the version of me that was capable of building something significant could not fully breathe. Not because of anyone's intentions, because of the aggregate atmospheric effect of people whose relationship with what was possible was fundamentally different from the one I was trying to develop. The habit changes I made during that period were real. The mindset work was genuine, the systems were thoughtfully constructed, and all of it was partially undermined, consistently, structurally, invisibly, by a social environment I had never once examined as a variable in my own execution. The most productive version of you does not emerge from better habits alone. It emerges from habits practiced inside a social field that makes those habits the norm rather than the exception. That reinforces the standard rather than accommodating the deviation from it. That makes the person you are trying to become feel less like an aspiration and more like simply who you are when you are with these people. You cannot fully become someone your social environment has no reference point for. Find the people who make your best version feel ordinary, and spend more time with them. I'm Mr. Oscar, this is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.